Great. Well, hello everyone. We'll just give everyone a few minutes to tune on or a few seconds to tune on. But my name is Raquel Dancho. I'm the Member of Parliament for Kildonan and St. Paul here in the northern suburbs of Winnipeg, Manitoba. I'm also the Shadow Minister for Future Workforce Development and Disability Inclusion. And we're very honored to be joined today by Pierre Poilievre, the Member of Parliament for Carleton, just outside Ottawa, who's also the Shadow Minister for Jobs and Industry, or Industry and Jobs. And we're just so thrilled to have you, Pierre. We've had so many people emailing us and just saying how excited they were with all of their questions. And they're just thrilled that you're making time for us virtually in Kildonan and St. Paul today. So thank you so much.
Great to be on the prairies. I wish I were there in reality rather than just virtually.
Yeah, and for folks watching locally, Pierre's been a huge supporter of us in our campaign in Kildonan and St. Paul. Pierre's actually one of the first MPs to come out and do a lunch fundraiser for us when we were allowed to gather about 2 years ago, and that was it was hugely popular. So Pierre's been a longtime supporter of us here in Kildonan and St. Paul. So I'm glad to have you again, Pierre.
Well, I'm actually from Calgary as well,
Oh, I didn't know
originally,
that.
though I moved to Ontario when I was in my early 20s where I got elected. But I'm from Calgary, so I'm a prairie boy at heart. And so I'll be at home with you all while I'm doing this Facebook Live.
Oh, that's great. Well, welcome home.
Thank you.
Great. So we have so many topics folks wanted to hear your perspective on tonight, Pierre. And really, in the last week, it's all been about C10. And people are very, very concerned. I actually have a lot of folks who have not been very, very active, particularly on the conservative side or just really in politics in general. Even folks, even friends from high school that have reached out to me saying, what's the deal with Bill C10? So you've been talking about C10 for months. I remember very vividly a speech that you delivered in the House of Commons in the fall about this bill. So do you want to walk us through sort of what was the genesis of this? And in the past week, it sort of took a turn for the worst and made it even a more scary bill for freedom of expression. So, do you want to sort of lead us through your thoughts on this bill and where we're at today?
Sure. Well, it all began with an unholy alliance of broadcasting corporations, cultural industries, and government, all of whom were interested in having more power and control. Now, traditionally, they had a lot of control. The heavily regulated broadcast sector shut out competition and kept it in the hands of an oligopoly of a very few different voices, heavily regulated by the CRTC, which is the major telecommunications and radio regulatory body. And this body has had a lot of control over what Canadians read, see, and hear. But then along came the internet, and the internet bust open the conversation. Everybody could have a voice. Every single Canadian could be his or her own newspaper, radio station, or television network, as we're seeing right now with this conversation that is currently still legal. And but then, so these groups said, why don't we pass a law to take all of the old model from the broadcasting system and apply it to the internet, so that government could regulate what voices Canadians hear and what they say online. And this, to me, from the very outset, was a horrible idea. It was an attack on the newly expanded freedoms that while they were fresh and new with the technology of the day, they're ancient in that they go back hundreds of years in our English system of liberty. So it was bad enough to start with, but what happened midway through the process in committee is that the government amended the bill to take out exemptions that would exclude users like you, I, your grandmother, and everyone else from the regulation. And as a result, there was this explosive response led by a professor, Michael Geist, who's no conservative, by the way. He is just an expert on digital issues, has been in the past critical of all political parties, but he said this was an outright assault on freedom of expression online. He called this government the most anti-internet government in Canadian history. Then a former commissioner of the CRTC, Peter Menzies, came out and said that the bill was like a hammer that would intimidate freedom of expression. And so that's how this debate started. And I'm happy to get into more of the details, but I don't know, what do you think, Raquel? What's your experience with the bill so far?
I find it very scary. I think the liberals really don't have any credibility on for us to trust them, and they consistently ask in sort of bills that are framed in attacking personal freedoms. They say, "Oh, just trust us. It's not for that. We're not going to censor you, Pierre. We're not going to censor,
Right.
Kildone and St. Paul videos. It's just those big bad Amazon and YouTube." But my instant thought when it took a turn for the worst at committee there a couple of weeks back was we're also already seeing a lot of conservative censorship in North America, and that this is sort of their hammer to further beat conservative commentators with. And that's maybe an extreme opinion, but I thought, who knows if the liberals get some sort of majority down the line and they have full power to build their socialist utopia. Maybe I'm going too extreme here, but just to say, what are they going to tell us that you and I can't talk about anymore? Maybe we won't be able to talk about inflation and debt and personal freedoms and personal responsibility and the more, and the benefits of capitalism and free markets. I don't know, but we're seeing that already in the United States, a lot of censorship of conservatives. So that's where my mind went and immediately with this bill.
Well, you shouldn't call it extreme to think that way. That is, they've given us plenty of hints. Well, let's just start first with who is Justin Trudeau. He's a guy who was asked the question, "What is the government and all around the world that you most admire?" Of almost 200 different governments, he said, he said he admires the basic Chinese communist dictatorship. That was his word. His word. He was asked by a friendly audience about his favorite government on planet Earth. That's the one he chose. He also said Fidel Castro is a more remarkable leader. Those were his words. And actually, that
Unbelievable.
one, you can't even just chalk it up to another um, mental hiccup for an unrefined thinker. This one was actually written down. This was a
Yeah, didn't he
statement.
tweet it?
He
Yeah.
actually had a prime ministerial statement that would have been vetted by his top staff before it went out. So this is what he thinks. When there was a violent attack on a French newspaper for posting an politically incorrect a cartoon, he sided with the attackers and said that freedom of speech is not unlimited. So that's the mental frame here, right? So he's now saying he wants to protect Canadian content online. Well, what is Canadian content, really? So
What
what is
he
Canadian
says it
content?
is.
So CBC regurgitates CNN news stories about American politics. Doesn't Many of these stories don't even mention the existence of Canada. They're recorded in Washington, they're about Washington, and yet that is considered taxpayer subsidized Canadian content.
Right.
A community association in Kildone and St. Paul puts out a online newsletter about something very important to the residents there. Canadian neighborhood, Canadian author, Canadian material. That would not be considered Canadian content by CRTC, and therefore not be promoted in this new governmental algorithm that they want to take out. And furthermore, think about controversial commentators, right? Who do you think among commentators in Canada generates the most consumption of Canadian content? I would be willing to wager it's Jordan Peterson. You
Mm,
don't have to agree with Jordan Peterson. I
right.
happen to think he's very intelligent and very impressive, but you
I
don't
would
have to
agree.
agree with him. But
Hmm.
millions around the world consume his Canadian content. How likely is it, do you think, that the CRTC is going to consider that to be the kind of Canadian content that's allowed? I doubt it, because his views are politically incorrect. And
Hmm.
so you can imagine that that would be cast aside. Furthermore, Trudeau says he wants to stop the misinformation from being spread around. Well, what does he consider to be misinformation? When the Globe and Mail reported that the PMO had pressured Jody Wilson-Raybould to drop the charges on SNC-Lavalin, he said it was not true. It was misinformation.
Yeah.
So if that's misinformation, would that have been taken? Would CRTC have taken that down from the internet? The PMO said it's misinformation. We can't allow misinformation to spread.
Hmm.
So would that have to be taken down?
That's a good
So
question.
when you start to ask questions about what could actually be removed, who could be silenced, whose Facebook page, YouTube channel could be erased, and what would actually be allowed to appear in your news feed when when you are scrolling, I think we have a great reason to be worried, and that's why we're fighting tooth and nail to stop this bill. Conservatives at committee are filibustering it, blocking it there. We're going to fight it full on in the House of Commons. We need you to pressure the NDP and the Bloc Québécois, because if those two parties can be convinced not to pass it, the bill will be killed.
Right. So we need everyone watching to reach out to their NDP, or if they have Bloc Québécois relatives or what have you, we need that pressure to be put on all MPs across the spectrum, because this is sort of, and this is really a cornerstone of what makes the Conservative Party so strong and so historic in our country, is our commitment to freedom of expression. So I got the sense from our past couple caucus meetings, Pierre, that people are fired up and ready to sort of put on the armor and do everything we can to protect freedom of expression and freedom of speech in Canada. So I know we're fired up. I know our supporters are fired up. As soon as folks heard you were coming on, they were so excited to hear your perspective and what you've been doing and talking about against this bill. So I think the tides are turning a little bit. We did see, I mean, the minister who's responsible for this is a terrible communicator, but we did see him sort of start backtracking a little bit a couple days ago, saying, well, we'll make it crystal clear. So again, I don't think that the Liberals have any sort of a leg to stand on this. So I'm not going to trust any sort of subtle amendment they make. It needs to be blatant and clear that user generated content is going to be,
We
that
have to
they're, that's
we have
right.
to kill this bill. We can't. There's no amendment that
That's
can
what
fix
I'm
the bill.
thinking. Yeah.
We
Like
just have
I
to
don't
kill the
trust
bill.
them
There's
to
no
make,
look. Here's
yeah.
the problem: user generated content is their explicit attack on personal expression.
Mhm.
But even if they're regulating the big platforms, where do all our posts go on
Well,
those
this is what I was
platforms?
thinking. Are they going to start, regulating sort of conservative YouTube channels? Because
Of
that's
course,
from a company that's generating that. There's a lot in the United States. We're starting to have, we have our own, Jamie Schmale has his conservative podcast. So is
right.
that going to be considered a private user, or is he going to be viewed
As a
I just had so
broadcaster,
many, exactly. So
yeah,
I would agree with you. I think this bill needs to, well, there's a lot of bills I'd like to throw right out the window, but this one in particular, I think, and this resonates, I would say, across the political spectrum as well. I know a lot of moderate people that, have gone both ways in various elections that are saying, well, they're going to tell me what I can watch on the internet. And those ads we've had have been quite effective to sort of show you're going to see this message on a YouTube page pretty soon.
absolutely, absolutely. I've got a petition on my Facebook. If you're interested, go to my Facebook page, click through. Over 10,000 people have now signed it, and
Fantastic.
we'd love to have more names added to the list, and that will allow me to communicate with you all on what we're doing to fight this bill and defend free speech.
Yeah, well said, Pierre. And we look forward to those updates. And thanks again for working hard. And I know all of us are really beating the drum on this. So I have a good feeling that we're going to be triumphant, but we'll see. We need Canadians' help. So that's our call to
Absolutely.
action to everybody watching. Step up and email your MPs. I did want to talk, I'm just going to change gears a little bit. I did want to talk about, and you and I talk a lot about this, particularly you in your industry role. I don't know about you, but I still held out a little bit of hope for budget 2021 that the Liberals were going to come through and provide some sort of plan. Even if I wasn't going to agree with the plan, I was expecting to see a coherent plan that was going to help our economy recover and provide some sort of pathway out of this absolute health and economic disaster. I was hoping to wake up after budget day and see finally a plan. And there was not a single headline then or since then that has proclaimed there was any sort of coherent strategic plan in the budget. So, your thoughts?
Well, they want a credit card economy. We want a paycheck economy, and that's
Right.
the debate. Do we want to permanently put our economy on the national credit card and add to the debt, or do we want people to earn paychecks that not only put food on the table, roof overhead, and money in their pockets, and that's basically what we want the debate to be about, because that's what it is.
Hmm.
We think that the way to bring back a paycheck economy is to unleash the fierce power of the free enterprise system, to speed up the approval of major resource projects that generate tens of billions of dollars of wages for Canadians, that we knock down interprovincial trade barriers, that could actually raise the household income in Canada by $6,000 per year by lowering consumer prices and raising wages. That we could make this the fastest place on earth in which to get a building permit. Right now, we're
Wouldn't that
ranked
be great?
we're ranked 36 out of 37 OECD nations. It takes 170 days longer in Toronto to get a building permit for a warehouse than it does to get one in the United States of America. So where do you think the money's going to go? It goes where it can build. And you can't build anything in Canada. You can't get anything approved for construction. We're a country that can't let any, it's a gatekeeper economy now, where folks have to stand behind these privileged gatekeepers who prevent any construction from happening and wait and wait and wait while the rest of the world moves on. So we need to unleash the free enterprise system, get rid of the gatekeeper economy, reform our tax system to reward work, investment, and savings. That could have been the plan in this budget, but instead all we get is more credit card debt.
Yeah, and there was really nothing, no even indication that they're interested in that. And I think red tape reduction is a pretty standard thing when you want to unleash, the potential of your economy. And there wasn't even a peep of that in a 700-page document. And they seem to be really moving away from our natural resources, whatever they are, whether it be mining, precious minerals, whether it's energy, lumber. Like there was even agriculture. There was, some softball sort of one word in a sentence mention of them, but very little commitment to. Canada is one of the most blessed nations on earth for natural resources, and we're in an economic crisis. So not only are they not talking about reducing red tape to unleash private sector investment and innovation, but they're not even talking about utilizing the natural resources we've been blessed with more so than almost any other nation on earth. In fact, they've been indicating for 6 years that they're moving away from utilizing one of our major competitive things that we have in this country, which is natural resources. So I just found it to be one of the biggest letdowns. And yet at the same time, Pierre, we know it was one of the largest, or was the largest budget, is the largest budget in Canadian history. We didn't spend this much when we were defeating the Nazis in World War II. And yet there's not a single plan that any Canadian can feel confident that they're actually going to do something about this. I mean, they talk about childcare, but you and I both know that's going to be years before, if ever, we're going to see any childcare spaces. And yet they're sort of saying that's going to be the economic recovery uh, golden ticket or something. So I
Right.
just found it incredibly disappointing.
This childcare debate is fascinating. So let's take a look at their proposal. First of all, they're saying they're going to base it on the Quebec model. Well, in Quebec, there are 50,000 kids that without a daycare space that are on the
Mm,
waiting list. So after all the billions of dollars of subsidies, the government-run program there is depriving 50,000 kids of a daycare space. And all their parents, by the way, have to pay taxes into the system, but they don't get a daycare space out. Secondly, it's a one size fit all model where it's like the old the old system where you can have any color you want as long you can have any color car you want as long as it's red. um, you have to pay for the one model even if you don't want to use it. So if you're, God forbid, a parent who wants to stay at home with your kids, or you have grandparents that want to take care of the kids, perhaps there's a neighborhood
mhm.
community-based model that works for you, like an in-home daycare. All of those things are still legal, but you'd have to pay twice if you want to use them. You'd have to pay once in
Right.
direct fees and then once also in taxes. So basically, it's a design to force parents to direct their childcare dollars through the state rather than letting them make their own decision. And then let's consider just let's use our own common sense and ask which of these two models makes more sense. A, the state takes childcare money away from parents in the form of taxes and gives it to the federal government, which gives it to the provincial government, which gives it to the municipal government, which gives it to a childcare agency, which assigns that family a daycare. Or B, the family takes its childcare money and chooses its own childcare option.
Mm,
Which of those seems to
that one.
be more sensible in terms of good, simple management? I think the latter obviously is, because after the trickle down economics doesn't work. When government takes money and then expects it to trickle back down to the people who paid for it in the
Just gets
first place,
gobbled up.
it just gets gobbled up by the bureaucracy. So
Mhm.
why not just leave the money with parents? Let them decide. It's not perfect. It will always be expensive to raise kids. Any politician who says otherwise is lying. And by the way, the government is not promising $15 a day daycare. they're promising $60 a day daycare. They're just going to force you to pay the 15 on directly in fees and the other
Yeah.
45 in taxes. You're not going to erase the cost of the facility, the carpenters who have to build it, the employees who work at it, the administrators who run it. In fact, the cost will be higher when the government does it. So let parents have the autonomy and the freedom and the choice. And I think on that platform, we're going to win if we have a contest on it in the next election.
Yeah, very well said. And I know there's parents watching, and I know I'm of the age that all my girlfriends are having kids, something that we're thinking about in our family as well. And the second option you talked about is much superior, much more valued by parents saying, why can't I choose how I'm
Mhm.
going to do this? And something that the Liberal plan failed to address and consistently has failed to address and even mention in the last 30 years that they've been talking about this, announcing it 8 times or 9 times, is that a lot of the problem is at the provincial regulatory area where there's in Manitoba, when we were in opposition 5 years ago and I was a policy analyst there, one of my tasks was to review all of the red tape to open a childcare center. So I printed it
Right.
off. It was 3 feet high to
Wow.
open a home-based daycare, just a little home-based daycare. Now, I went to these when I was a kid, in someone's basement, played video games, had snacks, played in the backyard. I don't think there was a lot of regulations in the 90s, and I turned out, decent, I would say. And
Right.
yet now, after 17 years of NDP government, before the PCs had their historic win in 2016, 17 years of NDP socialism and 3 feet of red tape regulation to open a home-based daycare, let alone a public sort of daycare. So I think that speaks for itself. You can throw money at the problem, but if you're not working with municipal and provincial governments to cut down the regulatory burden, you're not gonna be able to open them. It's just not feasible unless you're pouring, as you said, billions of dollars into these spaces. So, which is their plan. And another thing I thought was pretty misleading. They said that it's sort of revenue neutral, but studies have shown that the Quebec model only pays for 40% of the cost. So 60% of it, they're thinking, well, the moms are going to be working, so we'll get their tax revenue. The childcare workers are going to be working, so we'll get their tax revenue. But despite all these extra people working, there's still 60% that you have to take from more tax dollars from parents.
But
So
again,
it's
think about the logic of
unbelievable.
it for a sec.
It's
Even like
unbelievable to me.
instead of we having the war of the studies, they'll have a study that
For
says it's
sure.
here's just kind of let's just go right to the logic. So let's say that this government daycare space increases the Smith family's household income so much that they're going to pay enough taxes to cover the cost of the daycare space. That's the theory, right? The
Right.
Smith family gets a government daycare space, therefore both Mr. and Mrs. Smith can go to have a job, and therefore they'll both earn more money and pay more taxes, and it pays for itself. That's the logic. Okay, if that were true, why wouldn't the Smith family just take the extra earnings they've earned and pay directly rather than paying through their taxes?
That's right. Well, and I know, good point on studies. There's always competing a war of studies. But what's interesting in the Nordic models, all the Nordic countries that have national daycare,
Hmm.
women still choose to work part-time or to want to stay home for a couple years. That's still predominantly, or in many cases, at least half or a third of parents still making that choice. So again, like if it's all things being equal, and if childcare is going to cost you as much as you're going to earn if you go to work, a lot of moms are saying, I kind of want to just stay home part or work part time. And the Liberals, Chrystia Freeland, the first female finance minister, is trying to take that choice away from young women or from
Right.
mothers. That it particularly I found quite condescending and didn't appreciate in her lack of acknowledging that, women will like freedom of choice with childcare, and she's planning to take that away. So,
Exactly. And
yeah,
it's funny. Bob Ray actually once said that we needed more family sponsorship immigration. And he said one of the reasons was because new immigrant families like to bring the grandparents and it's a child care system for them. The grandparents take care of the kids throughout the
completely.
day, and the parents go to work. And that's wonderful, I think. And I know that's a preferred option for a lot of people. That family that does that gets nothing from this. They have to pay taxes for the state-run program, but they don't actually get any benefit from it because they make a choice that the Trudeau government does not approve of. So really, it comes down to a very simple principle. Who decides, parents or politicians?
Well, we know what Chrystia Freeland wants.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Politicians.
Yeah, that's right. In all things, what we see on the internet, how we raise our children, and we can
Yep.
go on and on and on of all the decisions Miss Freeland would like to make for us in our personal lives. So hopefully we can end that reign soon enough. But I think before they do that, I think the Liberals are hell bent on bankrupting our country with all the debt that they've added. And just for some context for folks watching, before this historic crisis hit, the Liberals added $100 billion of debt to Canada. And they promised, well, remember back in 2015, if it wasn't bad enough, they promised three modest deficits of $10 billion to quote unquote kickstart our economy. And yet they spent $100 billion in their first term. And yet and at the same time, we had sluggish economic growth and
Yeah.
billions of dollars of investment flee our country. So then the pandemic hits, and well, Pierre, do you want to sort of take us off of what we saw in this budget for record deficits there?
Well,
Unbelievable.
since the pandemic hit, so last fiscal year the deficit was $352 billion, which is 7 times
Unbelievable.
bigger than the previous all-time record. As a share of GDP, it's about 16% of GDP. To put it in perspective, yes, this was a crisis, but we've had many other crises. Just let me put it in perspective. In World War I, our deficit was 8% of GDP. In the Great Depression, it was 6% of GDP. In the Great Global Recession, it was 4% of GDP. So when you adjust for inflation and the size of the economy, last year's deficit was twice what it was in the First World War, 3 times what it was in the Great Depression, and 4 times what it was in the Great Global Recession of 0809. Only in the Second World War have we had a bigger deficit as a share of our economy. In that case, the deficit reached 23% of GDP. Of course, we were fighting Hitler, Mussolini, and the Imperial Japanese at the time, so that was a good justification to run a deficit. But here's the difference. Within 1 year of the end of the war, our ancestors were running the biggest surplus in Canadian history, 5% of GDP, which would be the equivalent of $120 billion surplus today. They
Wow.
immediately began paying down the debt. And in the ensuing years, from the ensuing 3 decades, the economy grew in nominal terms, that's both GDP growth and inflation, by 11 times. It was 11 times bigger in the mid 70s than it was in the mid 40s. If you adjust for inflation, it was 3 times bigger. So, in other words, our ancestors just unleashed the productive capacity of the free enterprise system to vaporize our
Wow.
national debt. And by the time Pierre Elliott Trudeau became prime minister, we basically had no debt in Canada. Our ancestors fought for our freedom and then they fought for our finances and left us on solid ground. Of course, the old man Trudeau blew the budget and did the same thing as his kid is doing. And you know what the result was of that? We don't. I don't want to
I
sound like an
do.
accountant here. I want to talk
No, no,
about
go
the
ahead. Uh,
human
you're going to talk about the
cost.
90s? Yeah. Okay.
No, not even the 90s.
We'll get to
The
that.
early 80s. With the 90s is when they had to finally start cleaning up the Liberal mess. But in the
Right.
early 80s, inflation hit 12%. Unemployment, that was a record in the post-war era. In unemployment hit 12%. So combined, when you add unemployment and inflation, they call that the misery index. It was at 24%, which is an all-time record in Canadian
Unbelievable.
history. The interest rates shot up to 18% in order to tackle the massive Trudeau-induced inflation. And then poverty increased by 650,000 people. 650,000 more people fell below the poverty line. And finally, because of there was so much misery, our suicide rate hit a record in 1983 of 14.8 suicides per 100,000 people. That is the highest by far in our history because people were losing their homes. I remember I was just a little kid and we had to move into a smaller place. We had to sell, my folks had a rental property. They had to sell that. And we needed to get help from my grandfather just to stay afloat because
Wow.
interest rates just crushed everybody. But that's what happens when you run massive deficits and pay for it with printed money. You get runaway inflation, which drives up interest rates. People lose their homes, they lose their jobs, and they become so anxious and terrified about what's going to happen to them. Many of them just end their lives. So it's a very serious, real human cost that results. Often it takes a while for it to kick in. I mean, Trudeau was prime minister from the late 60s until the early 80s. It took a decade for him to get, for all of the damage he did to metastasize into that human tragedy. But that's where we're headed if we don't change course soon.
Unbelievable, unbelievable. And if there's any left, I doubt there is, but if there's any left-leaning people watching, I think the social impact of this kind of spending, and like you outlined in the 80s, was terrible. And then all of our coveted social programs had to be cut in the 90s. People forget this, but tuition rates skyrocketed in the 90s because the federal government, as you know, cut education transfers to provinces. They cut healthcare transfers to provinces, something that people don't realize. Particularly in Manitoba, there was the Conservative Filmon government in the 90s. And I spoke to the cabinet ministers from that time. They told me when they were sitting at the table and received the massive historic cuts in healthcare. They looked at, like, what are we going to do? How are we going to afford our healthcare system with hundreds of millions of dollars? Again, this is the 90s, so that's a lot back then, of cuts to our healthcare system that's already strapped. They had to make really tough calls that the NDP ironically continued to bring up 25 years later. And yet it was big government, big spending policies that caused that. EI, again, another coveted social program in Canada, was also cut. So there are real consequences that are
Well,
coming down the road, Pierre,
and
from
let's
stuff like
remember,
that.
those cuts were not a choice.
They
Those
had to.
cuts were a mathematical inevitability. Liberals did them. The NDP
Hmm.
did them. In neighboring Saskatchewan, here the NDP in Manitoba can blame the Filmon government. In neighboring Saskatchewan, the NDP government closed 40 hospitals, mostly in rural communities, because they ran out of money. The federal Liberal government, under Chrétien and Martin, cut spending by 10% in one budget cycle. In absolute terms, they cut healthcare by $20 billion. Left-leaning governments did the most vicious cuts. Why? Because there was no money.
Hmm.
Like there was a cabinet meeting in that now John Manley, former Liberal Prime Minister, Deputy Prime Minister, talks about, where Finance Canada officials came and said to the ministers, "We went to the bond market today to borrow some money." And the minister said, "How much were you able to borrow?" And they said, "None." And everyone chuckled and laughed and thought it was a figure of speech and said, "So what do you mean none? I mean, did we get a billion, 100 million, 500 million? Sounds like we had a bad day." And the bureaucrat said, "We're not exaggerating. There's no one on planet Earth that's prepared to lend money to the government of Canada. No one. Zero. There is no money. There is, out of the billions of people who occupy planet Earth, we couldn't find anyone that would lend money to the government of Canada. And that is why they cut. They literally had no money left. And that's where we're headed. Now, at that time, the federal government had a debt to GDP ratio of 66.6%. Now we're at about 50%, rising, expected to rise to 55% over the next several years. And that's assuming that the government keeps its promises on spending, right? And as you pointed out, they promised deficits of no more than $25 billion. And in their first year term in office pre-COVID, and they racked up 100 billion. So they were
They have no
300% higher
credibility on
than
their
they said they
promises.
would. Yeah.
Yeah.
So if they say it's going to be, our debt is only going to reach 55% of GDP, we can count on it being a whole lot bigger if they're in power. My message is, let's fix this problem before it becomes a crisis and a human tragedy. Let's avoid massive cutbacks by protecting our finances and securing our future now.
Here, here. And you've done a significant amount of research and been reading. You're one of the most well-read people I know, Pierre. And you recently have talked a lot about in your speeches. About a month ago, you were talking a lot about this fascinating book you read about that really studied 800 years of financial crises. And I think it was called "This Time is Different." And I think you talked about 5 indicators that sort of or indicate a looming financial crisis. So, in very short order, can you kind of walk us through those warning signs and what we're seeing now in Canada?
Yes, Harvard professors Reinhardt and Rogoff did an 800-year study of debt crises, and they are considered the world-renowned experts on governmental debt crises. One of them is actually, Reinhardt is now at the IMF doing as the policy director. And what they found is, the reason they gave the book the title "This Time is Different" is because every time the governments engage in irresponsible behavior and debt levels get to a point where there's a crisis looming, the politicians say, no, 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 this time's different. It won't happen to
Mm,
us. This debt crisis is something that happens to other people in other places. It won't happen for us. And this time is different. And they could come up with some invention of why it won't happen to us. But of course, it always does, because debt crises are about mathematical realities, not about opinions or ideologies. And they said there are 5 different leading indicators that precede a debt crisis. One is declining output. So that means the GDP goes down. Well, ours did. It went down 5% last year. That's a $120 billion drop in our GDP. So check. Second, a long-standing current account deficit. A current account deficit is when you as a country buy more from the world than you sell to the world. So if you buy more than you sell, the only way to make up the difference is to exhaust your savings or rack up debt. But we've had $300 billion worth of current account deficits over the last half decade. So we're buying more from the world than we sell to the world, and we're accumulating debt and burning our savings to pay for it. So we can check that box as well. The third leading indicator is rising household leverage. Well, Canada has the highest household debt as a share of income in the world, in the G7. We have a buck 75 of debt for every dollar of take-home pay. That's higher than any other G7 country, and it's nearing a record for Canada. So we can check that box. And then rising overall debt. Well, I've just explained the government debt is rising, but if you take a look at the debt levels of the corporate and household sectors combined with government, we now have $8.6 trillion of debt for a $2.2 trillion economy, which means we have almost $4 of debt for every $1 of income, which is twice the historic average ratio going back 60 years. It is by far a record. It is the second highest in the G7 behind only Japan. And it is among the highest on planet Earth. It is higher than the debt ratio that Greece had before its debt crisis 10 years ago, and higher than the Americans had before the subprime debt crisis. So we can check that box. And the final um, and leading indicator for a debt crisis is asset price inflation. So that is when land, stocks, bonds, and other assets inflate in value. And we have seen that. Our stock market, our TSX, for example, grew to a market value exceeding our GDP by 20 percentage points for the first time in Canadian history. So in other words, we have a much bigger stock market than we have economy, an underlying real economy. Bond prices skyrocketed during the lead up to the during the entire COVID crisis. And finally, real estate, of course, real estate up 38% since
unbelievable.
December of 2019, and up 31% from March 2020 to March 2021. So those are record increases in percentage and in dollar terms. And you have to consider how
Wow.
crazy it is. So Vancouver is the second most expensive most unaffordable housing market in the world. If you compare median income to median house price, behind only Hong Kong. Toronto is now number 5 in the world, was number 6, and they've moved down to number 5. So think about this. Toronto and Vancouver have more unaffordable real estate than New York City, than London, than the tiny island we call Singapore, and then countless other places that have more money, more people, and less land. We have one of the most sparsely populated nations on planet Earth, and
This is
yet
the thing.
we have among the most expensive real estate. We have more places where there's no one than there are places where there's anyone. And I think if you spread Canadians out evenly across our incredibly vast land, we'd each have something like 4 football fields to ourselves. And yet we can't find a place to live. How is that possible? According to CMHC, for a house to be affordable, the monthly payment should not consume more than 30%
Mhm.
of disposable income. Right now, the average house would cost the average Canadian 50% of pre-tax income. So think about that. 50% of pre-tax income is required for the average family to own the average house across Canada. And that, by the way, is with record low interest rates,
Yeah.
which bring the payments artificially low. Imagine when rates rise. Bottom line is that's the 5th leading indicator of a debt crisis, and we can check that box too. So 5 leading indicators of a debt crisis, we check all 5 boxes. If we don't transform from a credit card economy to a paycheck economy fast, we will have a debt crisis.
And this impacts the poorest people in our country more than anyone, which is something, again, if there's any left-leaning people watching, I would ask you to pay close attention to this. But if you're talking about home and prices going up 30%, how many people did we just phase out of ever hoping to own a home? Like millions of people. Home ownership is sort of a hallmark of Canadian freedom, of the Canadian family. It's a dream that so many Canadians have, new Canadians, and yet this inflation, which is a large part because of the spending, what we're seeing, has just priced out millions of people from ever being able to own a home. And that's something that's completely being lost in this narrative. And we can go on about that, but I know that you made this point very succinctly that all of this printing money is actually making the rich richer and the poor poorer, which is something liberals never want to talk about. But if you own a home, you've just grown your wealth by 30%. If you don't own a home, well, it's just gotten that much farther away from you being able to do that and aspire to that goal. So this is something that people forget about when we talk about modern monetary theory or whatever this current finance minister is pursuing, that what she's doing is actually hurting the poorest people in Canada and making them further away from that middle class dream.
Yes, absolutely. And they're basically printing money to pay the bills, as you said.
Hmm.
This is something they call modern monetary theory, and which is ironic because it's
Not
thousands of
modern,
years old.
yeah.
It's the oldest idea in the books. Emperors, dictators, kings have been paying their bills with artificially created money for as long as there has been money. You go back to, if you go to Europe, you look at European coins during the Napoleonic Wars, all of the silver content dropped because the kings that were fighting Napoleon needed money. So what did they do? They debased their coinage and replaced silver with copper so they could have more coins to pay their soldiers. Well, what happened is that those coins were worth less, and the wage earners of those times made less real money, more coins but worth less. And one of my favorite stories is that of Dionysius, who about thousands of years ago was the dictator of Sicily. He was a Greek dictator at the time, and they had drachma coins back then, and he was always running out of money because he lived a very opulent lifestyle. So what he did is he took the drachmas, and every one drachma coin he stamped it with a two. So he doubled the money supply and said, we're twice as rich now. And that's how he paid his bills. Well, of course, it allowed him to continue living in opulence, but the workers made half the real wage because each coin was worth half as much. Each drachma was worth half as much in real terms. And the same is true now when we're printing money. What does it mean? It means the working class gets a real pay cut because the price of everything else goes up. So housing is up 30% year over year.
Groceries.
Groceries are up. Food is going to be somewhere between 4 and 8%, depending on the different things you put in your basket this year, according to Stats Canada. Commodity prices are up 50%, 50% for commodities. These are the things that go into the goods and services that you buy. Fuel is up. So all of the essentials are more expensive because the government has printed money and increased the money supply by 20% in just 1 year. So what does this mean from a point of view of social justice, as our friends like to say? Well,
Mm.
we are inflating the price of the things that the rich own and that the working class buy. So if you own a $10 million mansion, the 30% increase in housing prices makes you $3 million richer. You've done nothing to earn that $3 million, but it's yours. But if you're a working class renter, your rent is going up because your landlord has to make up for the rising price of real estate. Your groceries have gone up, your fuel has gone up. And not only that, you will never be able to afford a house.
Mm.
So now you're stuck renting. So this is how the rich get richer and the poor get poorer. And then for what the rich then do is they borrow against their growth in equity and they buy more. And then that inflates in price, and this system rolls over and over and over until you have a small aristocratic class that passes wealth down generation to generation, and mass a working class that does all the real work. And that's what we're going to right now in this economy.
And I think one of the most ironic things too is Trudeau became in on this platform, real change for the middle class. I don't think the middle class quite thought this was the change they were going to be receiving after 6 years of Liberals. But here we are. And so we
You know,
have a just
they lost the change from their pockets.
it's exactly. They're feeling a little lighter walking around. And Pierre, this has been just fantastic. We have about a couple minutes left. I do want to end on a good note. So let's say there's an election, conservatives are elected. We have gone through this a little bit already, but I see there's a couple questions like, what would you guys do to turn the ship around? So Herculean effort it's going to take for sure. But so we're elected. We're staring down the barrel of record deficits, rising interest rates. I mean, you've touched on this already, but like, what are we going to do about this? How do we turn this around? And I think I'll just start with just saying, and Aaron O'Toole, our leader, of course, has been the only national leader to date that's come forward with any sort of plan of how to recover from this economic and health crisis. The only leader to date who's brought forward a plan, and he's been the only leader that said we need to have a gradual, database, safe, and permanent reopening of the economy. Again, the only one that's called for that. So I think that's where we start. That's the commitment we're going to make. And again, just walk us through a little bit. You've touched on this already, but we have 20 million strong workforce. Like obviously we have options of how we can make Canada one of the most prosperous countries in the world again and make tomorrow better than today for Canadians.
Right. Well, there are two parts to it. One is, and I was looking over my shoulder to see if I could find my biography of Benjamin Franklin, because he said it's there's really two simple things. They are industry and frugality. And by industry, he didn't mean necessarily corporate industry. He just meant everything that the human spirit can produce with your head and your hands. And so, how do we unleash industry? Well, as I said at the outset, we need full and complete free trade between our provinces so that we can lower consumer prices and increase wages. We need to knock down regulatory burden that block our First Nations communities from inviting commerce and resource development onto their lands where they so choose. Leaders like Manny Jules from Kamloops to Chief Louis in Osoyoos, Chief Jonathan in Penticton, Chief Bear in Saskatchewan, they all say we want to invite opportunity onto our reserves through business development, but the bureaucrats in Ottawa stand in the way and impose massive regulatory obstacles that prevent them from doing it. Also, they do not have the ability to collect any of the taxes or resource revenues from their reserves. So that means that they can't actually fund what is necessary in order to bring that industry. Imagine if our Indigenous communities could invite those opportunities onto reserve and into their communities so that they could contribute not just to their own well-being but to the national economy. We could um, reduce regulatory red tape at a national level by bringing in a 2-for-1 rule. That is to say, every time the government brings in a new regulation, it has to get rid of 2 existing ones. That would
Mhm.
lead to an organic reduction in the size of the red tape burden. And then we could impose serious verification to make sure that actually happens. We can reform the tax system to reward work, investment, and savings, all three of which are punished by a system that takes away more from people as they earn more. You know, if a person is on partially on assistance and they get a job, they lose more in clawbacks and taxes than they gain in wages sometimes, which prevents them from ever escaping poverty. We need to reform the system so people are always better off working. We need to unleash our energy sector. We have 1,220 trillion cubic feet of natural gas that could be displacing foreign coal around the world, but we're one of the hardest places on Earth in which to get a liquefaction facility approved. In Quebec right now, there's a $14 billion liquefaction facility that would convert Quebec's natural gas into liquid so that it could be transported around the world. But because of regulatory delays, Warren Buffett pulled $4 billion of his own investment.
Unbelievable.
We could have about 40 of these liquefaction facilities in Canada. You know how you liquefy natural gas? You
No.
cool it. You cool it.
Mm.
And what do we have in Canada?
A lot of
Cold.
cold
A lot of
weather.
cold. We have lots
No
of
kidding.
cold. And
All
so
right.
we have an advantage over the Americans in that, and yet they're eating our lunch. These are all things we could do. And then on the spending side, the frugality, bring in a pay-as-you-go law. So every new dollar in government spending must be matched with a new dollar of savings. That would prevent the endless creep of growing government because it would discipline ministers to have to look inward and find the money within their own departments rather than simply turning to the taxpayer, to future generations, or now to the printing presses. So industry and frugality, that's the way out of this. We go from a credit card economy to a paycheck economy.
Excellent, Pierre. I think everyone watching, I can't speak for everyone, but I can say that I certainly learned a lot. And I know that we're having a lot of amazing comments of everything that you're teaching us and sharing with us. And there's so many great ideas here. And I think first and foremost, really, all of what you said really signifies a real commitment to recognizing there's a problem and saying that we're going to fix it. The government hasn't even recognized, Chrystia Freeland has not once even hinted that we're spending a lot of money.
Right.
She will not even acknowledge that this is historic levels and that it is a little scary and there may be consequences down the road. She won't even acknowledge that or anything that we've talked about tonight. So we're conservative. If there's a conservative government, you have a great plan. I know our MPs have great plans. Aaron O'Toole has the same values in this as we do. And I know that he's committed to this, which is far more than we're seeing in Ottawa, and just the polar opposite, really, of this sort of attitude of, as you said, this age old modern monetary theory, and that there will be no consequences for what's going on today, which is really the message that the Liberals are spending. It's all going to be fine. Just trust us, even though we have no credibility whatsoever. That's what I keep hearing from them.
Right, absolutely. And I think the work that you're doing is going to be important because we need to get young people into paychecks. They need paychecks. That's what young people are telling me. They want
Yeah.
paychecks. You know, Trudeau
Yeah.
says, well, don't worry, we'll just keep borrowing money to send out government checks. But young people understand they can't live on $2,000 a month forever, especially if it's borrowed money. So I think some of the ideas you're talking about to get paychecks to youth are going to be among the most important to get us out of this mess.
Yeah, and young people, particularly, you come out of high school and whether you're in university or technical colleges or you're in a trade, you're looking to earn a living and move up the ladder and get a home and all of those family milestones that have been a cornerstone of Canada for over a century, that have really been, just really been peace and prosperity beacons for millions of immigrants for 150 years or longer, actually. So that's what I hear from young people, that they don't want to live in their parents' basements on some student version of CERB. They want to get out there and make their own living and put their own stamp on the world. And yet, as you said, Trudeau's saying, just don't worry, we'll float the economy. What is it that they're saying? As much as it takes, as long as it takes. I think they're trying to say that to reassure people. And every time he says that, Pierre, I get a little bit of a shiver that runs up the back of my neck. Like, is he serious? He'll just spend as much as it takes without actually looking at any of the options, as we've talked about for an hour tonight, of how we could turn our economy around. Rather than doing the work, they're happy to just steal from future generations, which is the easy route, which seems to be this government's modus operandi, I guess.
Well, easy street leads to a dead end.
There we go. There we go. I think we'll end on that note, Pierre. It was just fantastic having you. Thank you so much for giving us your time, and we hope to have you again.
Great. It was a lot of fun, and look forward to next time joining everyone in beautiful Manitoba and getting back out onto the prairies again, breathing that fresh air and seeing that big sky.
That's right. Yeah. Well, we can't wait to have you and to see you in person again. And yeah, thanks so much for keep doing what you're doing. You have a lot of fans here in Kildonan and St. Paul, and you make us all proud to be conservative. So thanks again.
Likewise, great to be
All
with you.
right.